We are continuing our study on the book of Luke, called A Historical Study on the book of Luke, Luke 9:37 through 43, where Jesus demonstrates he is the Christ by driving out a demon, and he calls Israel an unbelieving and perverse generation, a perverse generation. Luke 9:37 through 43 says, the next day when they came down from the mountain, remember, Peter, James, and John were on the mountain with Elijah, Moses, and Jesus. It says a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I beg your disciples to drive it out," but they could not. And then Jesus responds with this phrase, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." This is Luke chapter 9, verse 41. You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Now that can be one of those times when we're thinking, wow, I don't understand. Jesus seems to be being harsh here. And this is where it helps to understand the full narrative of the Bible. Jesus is speaking to an unbelieving and perverse generation in Israel, a corrupt generation. He understands his audience. He understands their thoughts. He understands their motives. He understands their heart. This phrase, "you unbelieving and perverse generation," referring to first century Israel, is found in Deuteronomy 32:5 and 32:20, which we'll read momentarily. Something to know before we look at Deuteronomy 32:5 and 32:20 is the nations were created by God in Genesis 10 through 11. These nations were under the power of the satanic, demonic gods of the spiritual world. These nations worshiped these demonic gods. All right. Israel was created by God as a separate nation to shine the light of the one true God into these nations worshiping these demonic gods. Israel was to remain separate from the nations and not worship the gods and not mix and mingle with these nations so that they get caught up in the worship of these demonic gods. However, the people of Israel rebelled to God. They worshiped the gods of the nations, thus bringing the judgments of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 32 upon them. And this is where we find this phrase, unbelieving and perverse generation. They became an unbelieving and perverse generation because they were mixing and mingling with the nations and they were worshiping the demonic gods of the nations. We read about this in Deuteronomy 32:5 in the Berean Standard Bible. God's people have acted corruptly toward him. The blemish on them is not that of his children, but a perverse and crooked generation. So Deuteronomy 31 and 32 is the song of Moses. It's the song of the disobedience and the rebellion of the nation of Israel to God. It's the song where they worship the gods of the foreign nations. And in doing so, they became a perverse and crooked generation. It says the same thing in Deuteronomy 32:20. It says, "I will hide my face from them. I will see what will be their end." So there will be an end to Old Covenant Israel, which I think happened in AD 70. It's what the disciples asked Jesus in Matthew 24, what will be the end of these things, the end of the temple, the end of Jerusalem? When will they be destroyed? When is this whole structure and system coming down? And I think that's what's being referred to in Deuteronomy 32:20. It's the end of Old Covenant Israel here that ultimately found its fulfillment during the days of Jesus, ultimately in AD 70, because these are the verses that Jesus is quoting from when he says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." He's quoting from Deuteronomy 32:5 and Deuteronomy 32:20. They're a perverse, corrupt generation, children of unfaithfulness, Deuteronomy 32:20. So let's return to Luke 9:41 and read what Jesus said to the generation of Israelites during his time concerning them being an unbelieving and perverse generation. Luke 9:41. You, Israel, during the time of Jesus, an unbelieving and perverse generation. They didn't believe in Jesus as the Christ. They were a corrupt generation. They were mixing and mingling with the gods and the practices of the other nations. And Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you, this corrupt generation, this perverse generation, and put up with you before judgment comes? Because judgment was going to come on that perverse generation. Then he says, bring your son here. Jesus knew the thoughts of the people of Israel toward him. That's why he stated, how long shall I put up with you? Now, Peter also quotes directly from Deuteronomy 31 through 32 in Acts chapter 2, verse 40. And Peter says, with many other words, he testified, or Luke says about Peter in Acts 2. That's my phone that keeps going off. Luke says about Peter, with many other words, he testified, Peter, testified and exhorted them, unbelieving Israel, saying, save yourselves, referring to the judgment to come upon unbelieving Israel. And these judgments were based upon Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 32. And ultimately they occurred between AD 66 and AD 70 during the Jewish-Roman War. And Peter is saying, save yourselves from this perverse generation, this corrupt generation. So Peter is quoting Deuteronomy 32:5 and Deuteronomy 32:20. Jesus quoted those verses. Now Peter's quoting those verses concerning Israel being a perverse and corrupt generation and the judgment that was come upon them. In Acts chapter 2, Peter is addressing the judgment that Malachi said was coming, that Joel said was coming, based upon Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 32. So he's telling the people of Israel, save yourselves by calling upon the name of the Lord. Save yourselves from the judgment to come upon Israel by calling on the name of Jesus for salvation. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ. Those who called upon the name of Jesus for salvation were saved from the wrath and the destruction from AD 66 to AD 70. When ultimately Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. But those who rejected Jesus, they ran into Jerusalem for safety as they fled their cities and towns and villages, going into Jerusalem, and there they died in judgment. That's a lot of information, but Jesus warned about this judgment to come in Matthew 23 through 24, Mark 13, Luke 19, Luke 21, Luke 23. And here we have Peter exhorting the people of Israel to save themselves from that coming judgment upon Israel. They had corrupted the land, the people of Israel. They had corrupted Jerusalem. They had corrupted the temple. We read about this corruption in Revelation 11:18 and Revelation 19:2 as well. And then Jesus in Luke 9:42-43, he rebukes the demon, casts that demon out of the son. And it says all were amazed at his greatness. Now, a lot of demonic activity was happening in Israel. Why? Because they mixed and mingled with the nations, where the nations were worshiping these demonic gods. And now these demons are surfacing in Israel. Why are they surfacing in Israel? Because they mixed and mingled with the nations, and those demonic gods then came into Israel. And we see that in Revelation chapter 9:20 and Revelation chapter 18:1. You can read more about this or listen to more about this in my teaching, Luke number 47, Satan and his demons descend upon Israel. Number 3, as we read through Luke 9:43 through 45, Jesus reveals to his disciples that he will be delivered into the hands of men, which he was. Matthew 17:22 through 23 provides insight into Luke 9:43 through 45. Matthew 17:22 through 23 reads, when they gathered together in Galilee, Jesus told them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. So that's what it means to be delivered in the hands of men. He was delivered to the Pharisees, to the teachers of the law, to the Sanhedrin, to the chief priests, because they were wanting to kill him. And he was finally delivered into their hands by Judas Iscariot. You can read about that in Acts 2:23, just about the Jewish leaders wanting to kill Jesus, and having even the Romans become a part of killing Jesus in Acts 2:23, 3:11 through 15, 4:10, Acts 5:30, Acts 7:51, 53, and 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 15. And you see the Jews coming against the unbelieving Jewish people, coming against Jesus. There were some Jewish people who believed, of course. Paul was one, and Mary and Joseph, and the disciples, and others that we read about who believed in Jesus, who were Jewish people, but the majority rejected Jesus, and judgment came upon them. Number 4, Jesus teaches his disciples that the least is the greatest. We read about that in Luke 9:46 through 48. That became a big issue because the disciples would argue who's the greatest among them. And we see Jesus trying to teach them that the greatest among you is the one who serves. We see that in Mark 10:35 through 44, Luke 22:24 through 27, and Philippians 2:5 through 7, as well as John 13, when Jesus serves his disciples by washing his feet. And he was trying to show them that you're missing the point, that my kingdom is not about who can be the greatest. My kingdom is about being a humble servant of people. And so Jesus was trying to teach his disciples to be servants. Number 5, Jesus tells John that whoever is not against them is for them. That's in Luke 9:49 through 50. And number 6, Jesus corrects James and John for wanting to call fire down from heaven. Let's read about this as we conclude this study, Luke 9:51 through 56. As the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, that's going to be what we're going to study on our next study. We're going to totally focus on what did this mean as the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven. So we'll look at that in our next study. Luke 9:51 through 56, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. And remember, that's what personal disciples would do. They would go into villages, into towns, into cities in preparation for the arrival of the rabbi to come and teach in the village, town, or city. So that's what's happening in Luke 9:52. Jesus sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But in Samaria, the people there did not welcome him because he was headed for Jerusalem. Now, the Samaritan people believed that the true worship of God was in Samaria, and they despised those who thought worship of God was in Jerusalem. Those who believed worship of God should be in Jerusalem, though, they despised those who believed the worship of God should be in Samaria. So there was conflict between the people of Jerusalem and the people of Samaria. If you want to read more about that, read John chapter 4. That's Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Luke chapter 10, which we'll study here in some upcoming studies, the conflict between the Samaritans and those who thought worship of God should be in Jerusalem. Verse 54 of chapter 9. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, James ultimately would die in Acts chapter 12. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven? Now that reminds us of Elijah, who called fire down from heaven in 1 Kings 18:16 through 38, and in 2 Kings 1:10 through 12. Do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them, the Samaritans in the village who did not welcome them? But Jesus turned and rebuked James and John. Then he and the disciples went to another village. It's really interesting as you read through the book of Acts. Jesus says to go into Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. These people would have another opportunity to believe in Jesus as Messiah, believe in Jesus as the Christ before the judgment came upon Israel. It's a lot of information in this study. I have the notes on the gracereach.org website. Just go to gracereach.org, click on the orange button, Teaching Resources. It'll take you to a blue page. Click on the book of Luke. Go down to, I think this was teaching number 73.